Hello and welcome to the My RD Journey podcast. My name is Adam, your co-host and producer. With me, of course, is Felicia Peraza of Peraza Nutrition, perazanutrition.com, and My RD Journey. We're going to talk about some stuff important to RDs just starting out, looking to get into private practice. What are we talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about whether or not you need to go into clinicals after becoming a dietitian.
So whether or not you should go the clinical route after finishing your undergrad, getting your RD, and looking for your first job, it's often suggested that you should get into clinical as your first gig out of college.
So you're supposed to spend 2 years in clinical practice before doing anything else.
Clinical meaning, all right, so exactly, let's define our terms here. What do you mean by clinical?
So typically when they're talking about clinical, it's referring to like hospital-based care. So if you think about like inpatient as a dietitian, which could be, that you might be giving general nutrition education to people who are in the hospital or maybe also in the ICU, but that would be more like clinical setting is like hospital-based or even like a nursing home too.
So hospital or long-term care,
Yeah.
one or the other generally. That's
generally
what's considered clinical, and that's often what's recommended as your first job out of college. And who is saying this, that's what you should do?
So I heard this throughout my undergrad, and I actually hear it a lot from when I have interns in my practice, is that their internship directors are telling them, get into clinicals 2 years and then, expand into other areas. And I also heard this throughout my internship, and it's not something, you question because what do you know then?
So your college professors, your instructors, your internship directors, they are the ones saying, make sure you get a clinical job for your first couple years after you finish the RD program, after your internship, when you start working.
Yep.
Why?
So part of it is like paying your dues to the practice or to, the dietetics field.
To the industry? Okay.
Yeah, but also a lot of it was that, you don't have enough experience to really do, or at least this is how it was posed to me, was that you don't have a lot of other experience. So if you're working in like a hospital-based setting, you're likely going to be in a team of dietitians. And so there's people above you that are kind of helping to mentor you and guide you along your journey of becoming being a dietitian. But you're kind of working in this team atmosphere, still kind of learning medical nutrition therapy and all about different disease states, but that was a part of it, is learning more.
So that's why. That's why it's recommended that you do. I imagine also it's partially because there's high turnover and there's generally availability.
Yes.
So I worked in a setting where I was in a clinical environment working directly with dietitians, and some were there for several years, but many were only there for a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like there's pretty high turnover.
Yeah.
Which means those spots open up pretty regularly. So I imagine that the availability of those jobs is pretty good compared to maybe some other areas in dietetics as a new dietitian.
Yeah, they could be a good first job and could have, especially inpatient in a hospital setting, they might have a lot more openings than, kind of smaller niche areas like
what you did.
Yes, exactly.
So what your first job out of college was not in a clinical setting as a dietitian. I guess your first RD job was at the YMCA, right? A community center.
Yes.
Seeing people for one-on-one counseling sessions.
Yeah, so
right?
I did one-on-one counseling, and then I also did program type stuff. So I did like kids fitness and nutrition stuff combined together, but also like weight management groups and seminars about nutrition, and then the one-on-one stuff kind of got thrown into that too.
So that's what you did right out of college.
Yes.
You did not go the clinical route. And what we're talking about here, to be more specific, is that something, do you need to get a clinical job out of college? We're not saying you shouldn't, or that it's not a good way to go.
Yeah.
But it's posed as something you need to do. The mentality in college, in your undergrad, during your internship was, this is something that you must do.
Yeah.
It was posed as the inevitable outcome.
Exactly. Like you weren't supposed to do anything else because you weren't experienced enough to really do anything else. And that, you really need those 2 years of clinical before you decide to start a practice or do anything else.
Okay, so when we talk about those clinical jobs, what exactly are those jobs? What are they looking to have people funnel into? Specifically, what are we talking about here?
So a lot of this again was more so posed as the inpatient clinical dietitian. So, and this can look very different for different hospital settings. This includes like patient care where you might be giving like 10 or 15 minutes of education to somebody lying in a hospital bed after they just had a heart attack and giving them nutrition information there. You might be screening for nutrition risk. So when someone comes into the hospital, or, and this is not an area that I was in outside of my internship, you might be calculating tube feedings, and that might be maybe above where you might start as a dietitian inpatient, but that could be another part. And then also like general nutrition education. So some inpatient dietitians will do seminars for the nurses and the doctors or for other kind of support staff, whether it's for them or for them to kind of translate information to patient care. And then some also work in the outpatient space, but it's associated with the hospital.
I know that when I worked as the patient services manager in food and nutrition at a hospital, the dietitians that I worked with, a lot of what they did was bounce around from room to room and see patients, but they did a ton of other stuff too. They administered tests and quizzes on like different nutrition education topics to the staff in food and nutrition in the department. Technically, a dietitian was the manager of the call center to some degree, the call center where patients would call down to order their food, and they would administer education specifically to call center employees. And they worked with the hospital as a whole and did a variety of events and programs. We had a Kids in the Kitchen where a couple dietitians worked with the chef, and they had a fresh produce truck that would come, and they did these recipes with kids. There's a lot there, and my impression is too that specifically the jobs that you would find coming out of college as a dietitian, a new dietitian coming out of your program, would be clinical dietitian 1. So like the entry level dietitian job. And it's probably going to be at a big hospital where there's like a fleet of dietitians.
Yeah.
Generally not like, there are small suburban hospitals where it's like 90 or 110 beds or something. One dietitian works there and probably works at that hospital and another. That's not the job you're going to get. You're going to get the job at a big hospital in a big team.
Yeah. And that's kind of what they were referring to. Because there's like with long-term care in particular, I've seen that happen with dietitians where they're new to the field and it's one dietitian in a long-term care facility and they're the only dietitian. And they're also in charge of like many other things outside of like direct patient care with medical nutrition therapy. So it's, that can happen. But the jobs that they've really pushed us to were like the big hospital systems like you're referring to, where you're working with other dietitians, but you're also connecting with a lot of other healthcare professionals too. So it's not just that you're working with the dietitians and the patients, you're working with, internists, you're working with, the food nutrition staff as well. So you're kind of in this whole big, connection with the hospital too.
So one of the primary functions of a dietitian in a clinical setting is to administer medical nutrition therapy. Is that correct?
Yes. So,
okay. What exactly is that?
And this is medical nutrition therapy, and this is kind of the highlight of what dietitians do. I practice medical nutrition therapy in outpatient as well. So it's something you'll see definitely inpatient, but you will also see outpatient, especially if you work in private practice and take insurance. But this is an evidence-based medical approach to treating certain conditions. So things like chronic conditions like diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease. So it's the connection of, how nutrition really helps therapeutically with these conditions.
Okay, and that is something that clinical dietitians will administer to patients in this inpatient setting, but it's not something that is exclusive or even specific to inpatient dietetics in the clinical environment.
Yes.
Okay.
And it also involves what's called the nutrition care process, which if you're an undergrad, you will definitely learn about this. And if you're in your internship, you will definitely learn about this as well. And the nutrition care process includes the assessment piece for nutrition, and we kind of mentioned that a little bit, a diagnosis related to nutrition, some kind of intervention, which usually if it's like inpatient might be, involving supplement use like Ensure or things like that. Or the intervention could be like education and then monitoring and evaluating, which is normally following up on goals or like weight status. Like if someone needs to gain weight in the hospital setting, you'd be monitoring and evaluating that too.
Okay, so we're looking at and examining the notion that you need to go into clinical to to become an RD and to, pay your dues and whatnot, we're criticizing the notion that you need to do that, and we're questioning that here. But I imagine there are some benefits to doing it as your first job. What are they?
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of highlighted one of the big benefits is you're working in a team. So a new dietitian, and I remember when I was a new dietitian, I was like, what am I doing? Because you go through the internship and you're kind of moved from one thing to another, and then you get on your own and you're like, okay. So it can be really helpful, when you're working with other dietitians to ask questions about certain conditions, how to actually interact in this team setting, because mostly in the internship, you only have what's called staff relief, which is when you're you're the dietitian in those situations and you're making the decisions. And so you really might only have a week or two with the rotations that you're in. And that's not a ton of time to be able to really work.
Well, you
through.
don't know everything there is to know after 2 weeks. What are you talking about?
So it can be really helpful to be working with other dietitians that have been in the field for a while, been in that setting for a while, and can really help to mentor you. So that could be a huge perk too, obviously working in a hospital setting. They could be really great first jobs to get into. So like you mentioned, like turnover, people may stay for years, but some people might get in 2 or 3 years and move on to maybe like a specialty within clinical dietetics. So like dialysis or cancer and things like that. So it could definitely be a great first job, but then also, pretty good money, usually for clinical practice as well. So that could be, another perk as well.
Is it good money though?
Inpatient clinical? Yeah, I think on the we can actually link. There's a whole
Like the BLS stats from like BLS.gov or Bureau of Labor Statistics.
That's one, and also the Academy of Nutrition puts out like a salary report for all different fields of dietetics, which is really just cool to see. So we can link that too.
But I imagine working in a team setting is also very beneficial because you're going to have that safety net of people to like kind of catch the mistakes you make and guide you. You mentioned mentoring.
Yeah.
And well, I assume also that there is room to move up in the clinical setting. I'm very unfamiliar with the hierarchy, but I know that there's a clinical nutrition or clinical dietitian 1 and clinical dietitian 2, and there's a clinical nutrition manager job, and there's a structure, there's a ladder to climb there. If that is something you want to pursue long term, it is an option.
Yeah. Or if you're looking, like I mentioned, to maybe get into a specialty area, like I mentioned, like, kidney disease. That's one of my defaults to talk
about.
Like
renal patients?
Yeah. And so that might be something where you get into clinical, or maybe you want to be in clinical, but you're not really sure where. That might, get you in the door with a hospital system too. So that can also be really helpful. Is just kind of getting in the field, figuring it out a little bit if you know that clinical space is where you want to be in.
I imagine too the networking possibilities are pretty vast. If you get into like a big hospital system, you now have an in-network that is like hundreds of people.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine so, and I have to assume too that kind of a job could set a good foundation for you across the board as a dietitian.
Yeah, absolutely.
But all that being said, there are some downsides to getting into a clinical role as your first job. What are those?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest ones, which, for me, I didn't really want to go into clinical because I didn't like that short, kind of fast-paced.
Well, for the record, you had a job in a clinical setting that you were a call center operator.
Yes.
in food and nutrition in a hospital. So it's not like you were unfamiliar with it.
No.
You knew what you were going to get into, though.
Yeah, I think I had like, before I went into my internship, when I was an undergrad, I worked in a call center and, did tray delivery. And probably a lot of people do this now too, because I always recommend it to the students that I work with. And so that, I had kind of an idea of like what a dietitian did in the hospital setting. And then when I went through my internship, you got to see like more of the intricacies of like someone's day-to-day job. And I really didn't like the short, having to go into somebody's room when they're like half asleep, trying to talk about like cardiovascular disease and, eating healthier fats and all that. And then also the follow-up, I wanted more of like the, follow-up after the fact. And so for me, I felt like, why go into clinical right after when I can, for me, go into like a more community-based setting where I might be doing things that relate to private practice, which is something that I wanted to do. And so I think one of the issues with going right into clinical is that if your goal is not to be in the clinical space and you want to work in the community or have a private practice, it's not really setting you up for really all of the business aspect and how to run a private practice. Sure, it'll teach you more information about, being a great dietitian and, in terms of like medical nutrition therapy and different chronic conditions. But the whole aspect of how do you run a business? How do you get clients? How do you bill insurance? You're not taught that. So,
Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is while a clinical role as a dietitian could be beneficial just out of college for the reasons we talked about before, one of the downsides is that it's kind of cold and short-lived in terms of interaction with patients who would, in this case, be your de facto clients. The interaction is abrupt. They're generally not that interested. It's not a very gratifying exchange for you as the dietitian. And also, the scope of a clinical role is fairly narrow. You don't learn anything about how insurance works. You don't learn anything about the financial side of things or really the business side of things at all.
yeah.
The clinical route is very specific
Yes.
to a clinical role. It doesn't teach you anything else about how the business side of dietetics goes.
Exactly. And it's, again, if that's where you want to be, absolutely, that's a great place. But if your goal is private practice, it's not going to teach you not only how to run a business, but like we were talking about on last episode, like marketing, how to get clients and all of that. It's usually something someone else does, not you as the dietitian, usually in like a clinical space.
Okay, so if someone's not, what's another good first job? If someone doesn't want to go to the clinical route, but they want more experience before getting into a private practice, before they start a private practice, what should they do then?
Yeah. So on the first, I think it was the first podcast, we talked about different roles that dietitians can be in and different jobs. But I think two of the key ones that could be really helpful would be some kind of community nutrition space. So this can be working maybe at WIC, retail dietitians. I worked as a retail dietitian, so I worked in a supermarket. Great first job because you're not only counseling generally, but you're also running events. You might be doing seminars or webinars and, working in a team still because you're kind of communicating with other people, other managers, different areas of food service, the pharmacy. And so you're connecting with a lot of different people. You might be seeing a lot of different conditions because you're working with the public. So you really don't really know who you're going to get necessarily. But it's also a great kind of like first job to give you a ton of different experience in different spaces, but then still helping in terms of the private practice route.
So you had basically two community roles really early on in your career. You were a dietitian at the YMCA, where you did one-on-one counseling and you had a lot of community interaction there.
Yeah.
And you were also a retail dietitian at a supermarket chain. And you had a ton of community interaction there. And you saw a pretty vast breadth of different people. You ran classes, you did cooking demos, your experience covered a great number of things. And you also got a peek of the business side of some things.
Yes. And
talk about that a little bit.
So, and it was kind of in two ways. So one, the whole how products might sell in the supermarket, where you would like the marketing side of it. Marketing for classes, I was highly involved in that because my face was on everything, but also like creating flyers for events and talking about it and also sharing that information with all the different departments too. So like someone in seafood would have my flyer up, or if I was, doing a food demo with a produce item, I'm coordinating with the produce manager and then also creating a handout and, recipe. And there was a lot of, interaction with other departments, but in the business aspect of it, it was also, the financial pieces. So I used to have like products on my desk that I would promote in terms of thinking that they're really great for people. So it's not just I was pushing them because I had to, but it's really high in fiber and I wanted to promote this, or apples are in season and they're also really high in this. But then how did things sell, after I might have promoted them, because they had the dietitian, stamp of approval to say the least. So that was a big thing. And then also the aspect of, I think I mentioned marketing already, but like planning out events and like planning a calendar and like scheduling, which is something I do now in private practice. So there's a lot of like, it's like running a little business sometimes, in
Yeah,
the
it's kind of
store.
its own thing it's a business within a business. So
Yeah.
as a retail dietitian, you had one-on-one counseling sessions with
Mhm.
people. It was sort of a courtesy that the supermarket offered to customers. It was another reason to get them in the door. That was a lot of the value you brought
Yeah.
as a dietitian in that setting. Anything that's going to get people in the door is going to make them more likely to spend money. That's why it was worth it. Part of why it was worth it for the supermarket to pay you. That's part of what the job entails. So you had clients. People would make appointments with you.
Yeah, and people would come in, like I had people who would shop multiple times during the week, and every time they'd come in and, like, ask me about new products and they would always sometimes they'd shop more because they knew I was there, or they'd come because they know I'm doing a demo, and so they ended up while they're there, they grab a few things or, "Oh, this looks like an interesting product," and so it was, these extras that they were getting that they might not have if I wasn't there
But
necessarily.
it was a ton of organic interaction with people. You got a sense of what people wanted to know.
Mhm.
It was just such a high volume of personal interaction with people asking you about stuff pertaining to food and nutrition.
Yeah.
On top of that, you literally had to manage a schedule of employment of appointments.
Mhm.
You had essentially you had a client load
Yeah.
in a way.
Yep, client load, and then also there were certain events. We had like corporate dietitians too, and there were certain events, like types of events that were ran. They run each month, and so all the stores would be doing this type of event. They would always be doing a cooking demo. We had flexibility as to what we did, but so there was some, creating a month calendar in advance with all these planning of events, and then also the where the clients fit in and other classes that I wanted to run that I was able.
Yeah, so
So.
these are all skills that were really important to you that you drew upon as you got into your private practice even more. You also did group classes or like you had support groups.
Yeah, I did nutrition support groups, and I loved doing those. But I actually had 2 nights where I would do those because it got so big that so many people wanted to come to them. But I would talk about, like different products that we had in the store, but the whole point was being a support system for other people who wanted to, like live healthier lifestyles. And so, and it was also really nice because I could just grab products from the shelf and bring them upstairs to like talk about and show people how to read a label for like a food that they would actually buy. And so yeah, those were really fun.
Okay, so when you had a retail dietitian role and you were there for a couple of years,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, it was 3 years.
And then you were also a dietitian for the YMCA, the
Mhm.
community center, and that had some of the same sort of stuff where you had a client load
Yep.
and you had to produce materials for like advertising what you did
Yeah.
and coordinate with other people in the facility.
Mhm.
So, having to market yourself,
Yeah.
having to manage a client load,
Mhm.
having to deal with group classes, that is all stuff that directly transfers to starting a private practice. You would have gotten none of that at all in a clinical role
No. Yeah.
whatsoever. What are some other jobs that people could find that would kind of give them? I know you mentioned WIC.
Mhm.
So talk a little bit about that if you don't mind.
So with WIC, and a lot of my experience with WIC, because I never worked for WIC, but I had a 4-week rotation during my internship, and a lot of it was there's a couple spaces
Well,
there.
what is WIC?
Women, Infant, and Children is what it stands for.
So it's a government assistance program. They
Yeah.
had offices.
Yes. So they
Okay.
have different office locations, and so
And your 4 weeks you spent, what did you do?
So I did a couple of things. I did some seminars for they have nutritionists and dietitians there. And so I would do I think the one seminar I did was on like food nutrition trends. Because you're working with the public, and a lot of times with the public everyone wants to know what's the latest headline, and so people would come in and ask about specific, I heard this or I read this. But then also breastfeeding, because you're working with mothers who are pregnant but also maybe breastfeeding or have small children. And so, iron status, counseling on iron needs, and then also how to use the WIC checks that they had. So, what foods that they could purchase with it, kind of, how to stretch the budget, why healthy eating matters for like growth and development for children. So, there was the education piece for those who worked at WIC. So, like the nutritionists and the dietitians. with like new trends or new ways to kind of connect with the public. And then there was also the counseling side in working with the individuals who came through WIC to get their WIC checks, and they had the nutrition counseling piece as to like what I just mentioned.
So you had to do one-on-one counseling with people who, so to clarify, it's Women, Infant, Children is what WIC stands for. It's a government assistance program. People would come in, they would receive reimbursement from the government for food and...
Yeah, so they're called, and they actually don't use checks anymore. The program has changed. But when I was there, they did WIC checks, so it's printed. They're only allowed to buy specific items, and so a lot of times it would end up being formula, but like milk or like different grocery items. But they were very specific as to what they were allowed to buy, specific brands sometimes too. So it was very clearly printed, like on the check or in like a handout as to like here's how they're able to utilize these funds. So they weren't just given like money to go and buy stuff. So it's different than like the SNAP programs and things that are out there. But with those, they had to have at certain times during the month, they had to come in and sit down with the WIC nutritionists or the dietitians before they were able to get the WIC check and leave. And part of that was to help with, nutrition education.
Okay, so it was a requirement of the program for them to sit down and have a one-on-one session with you.
Yes.
That's how it ties in.
Yes.
That experience with them as your clients, quote unquote, in that environment was experience that would directly transfer to one-on-one sessions with a client base in a private practice.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's a good first shop.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of them too, like nutrition, I created a couple of nutrition education materials too, like handouts or recipe cards or bulletin boards, and sharing nutrition education information. And so that was another way, like I create handouts for my practice now. And so there's other little things like that outside of like the big, counseling and seminars that I was also doing that, in minor ways translated to private practice.
And so we've outlined 3 possibilities for roles. Are they all realistic roles that one could expect to get hired for fresh out of an RD program?
Yeah, especially like the WIC nutritionists too. And a lot of them will actually hire even, I mentioned nutritionists, and the reason why I use that term is that it may be a dietitian or not. So like when I was working there, or interning there, I should say, one of the WIC nutritionists had a bachelor's degree in nutrition, but hadn't finished the internship just yet. And so she was working there. And again, the counseling that the nutritionists provided that weren't dietitians, more general nutrition education to, again, keep within what the scope of practice is for them. But they weren't necessarily dietitians yet. So some people get into that field before they finish the internship, or if they are waiting to sit for the boards. And so it could be another way to get in even before you get that credential too.
Okay, that's good to know. That's probably one of the few examples of a job you can get without finishing your internship and getting your RD credential. Are there any other starting out roles, jobs that you think are good fresh out of a program?
I would say anything like community based. Like I'm highlighting, like a YMCA, but there's other kinds of like community centers like that where they might have like a wellness coordinator. So they wouldn't necessarily specify someone who's a dietitian, but could be working in like a coordinator space. They might be running nutrition programs, not necessarily doing counseling, but maybe even be on like the seminar program side or like employee wellness. So those could be things too, where it might not be a dietitian job, but that could be a way to get into. So
I'm shooting in the dark here. Are fitness centers or gyms or anything like that? Is any of that viable as a role or like a dietetics job? Do they have jobs like that?
Yeah. So some of them also have like health educators. So outside of like, fitness and coordinators, which generally are someone who might have an exercise science background or be a personal trainer, but they also have like wellness coordinators or nutrition educators too in those spaces where they have trainers, but they also have someone doing the nutrition piece. So
okay, so those are some viable options there. I mean, I think the big ones would be community and retail dietetics. As you've got clinical, but then you've got community dietetics and retail. And those are 3 big options fresh out. And then like I guess WIC or maybe the military has dietitians too.
They do have dietitians. And I was actually looking at a job for them a couple of years ago. But they do have dietitians. And actually, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but one of my internship preceptors when I was in food service, left after a week. She was the dietitian in food service, so she did nutrition education and was in charge of coordinating if children had allergies and the menus and making sure they fit with the guidelines for nutrition. But ended up joining the Navy and is a dietitian in the Navy. So,
So the military and then WIC as a government assistance program. What about schools? Don't schools have dietitians? Some of them?
a lot of the school, and this depends on the area, but a lot of the jobs that were school nutrition education were crossed over with the food service manager.
So it was
both.
like a dietitian who also worked as a food service manager
Yeah.
in a school that ran like a lunch program or something.
Yes. And in some of those cases, they may or may not require the dietitian credential. Some of them do, but some of them, the food service manager role doesn't involve needing, to be a dietitian. So,
But well, I guess I mean, you did one of your rotations in your internship at a school district.
yeah. And so the dietitian that was there originally obviously was a dietitian, but then I worked under the food service manager for a while until they brought in a new dietitian, but they wanted specifically a dietitian, but the one that they hired was actually going to take on part of the food service manager's role too. So it was a split role.
Okay, and well, just for the record, I mean, that is another viable option.
Yeah.
Fresh out of getting your RD, food service managers are often dietitians.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are a lot of roles where it's a combination of dietitian and food service manager, and not for anything, but working as a food service manager, I'm sure there are a lot of transferable skills, and especially on the business side of things, you learn a lot about money, where it goes, where it comes from, how it's accounted for when you work in a food service management role. So a lot of that could transfer right over to running a private practice, because when you run a private practice, when you have your own business in general, you have three hats essentially. You have the actual expertise of what you do, what your business really is. You have the financial piece, which is everything about money and taxes and how to manage your books and accounting, essentially.
Yeah.
And then you've got marketing and advertising, search engine optimization, stuff that we talked about in a previous podcast. But it's finance, marketing, and the business itself. So you wear all three of those hats regardless of what you do. As a dietitian in private practice, you're going to have to wear all three of those hats. If you can get some experience in any of the things in marketing or finance in any way, it's going to serve you really well when you move on to a private practice. All that said, if your plan is to go into private practice to begin with, why not just start there? Can you?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely. There are some things to consider. Like you might not get clients right away, and it might take time. Especially, we talked a lot about becoming an insurance provider, and it takes time to become a provider, as in to apply and wait for them to do the contracting and all of that. And so, getting referrals can then take time. So it's not like you're going to open your doors and then all of a sudden, maybe not necessarily going to have like a flood of clients right away. But this,
You'll get some, but you won't get a ton.
Yeah.
If you accept insurance early on.
Yeah, and even just like starting your practice too, there's some networking that's involved, and getting your name out there, to say the least. And so, that may not be maybe a feasible option for some people depending on your financial situation. So that might be something where private practice is your goal, and maybe you start it right away depending on what situation you're in, or maybe that involves getting a job, like we mentioned, some of the ones, or getting something part-time. Like there are clinical jobs that are part-time, and, even the community ones we're highlighting here, and, having the practice and getting that started on the side too. So, I mean, absolutely, I think you could definitely start with private practice. But again, it might not be financially feasible to start there right away.
So financial considerations are a possible downside for getting into private practice right away after you finish school. Are there any other major downsides to going right from getting your RD to starting a private practice?
Outside of financials, I would say just the getting it started, because, we talked with private practice, especially if you're virtual, you don't have to find an office necessarily. And there's, a lot of overhead that you might not need to consider, but there are things to make sure, like you're HIPAA compliant and making sure that you have everything set up to be able to see clients, especially virtually, and, having your phone number set up, all of those things, making sure everything again is HIPAA compliant, the forms. that might take, it's not going to take a year necessarily, but that might take some time initially too, which again kind of overlaps with the finances. So that could be something as well to consider.
I could see just going right into private practice as being a bit too much for a young person who is just finishing their RD internship and they're like 24 or whatever, and they're not used to being in the workforce yet.
Yeah.
You might not have everything you need as a human being yet to be able to do that and tackle it in an efficient way. It may behoove you to be a part of the traditional workforce for 2, 3, 4 years to build up some skills, get some grit, learn how to communicate in a business setting and become more professional, learn the ins and outs of being in the workforce and kind of just being an adult in general. I mean, we're talking about young people here.
Exactly.
So there are a lot of reasons to kind of cut your teeth, so to speak, by working a traditional job and then getting into private practice.
Exactly.
So the downside starting right away, I think we kind of touched on a little bit, but you didn't start a private practice right away. We talked about how you had a couple other jobs before you really dove into the practice full time. Can you just kind of walk us through your timeline? How did you get into it? And like, what did you start? You didn't start in private practice right away.
No. And I always say, like, I started my practice when I finished my undergrad. I really just had a website.
Yeah, you quote unquote started your private practice in that you sort of created a brand on a couple of free platforms. Like you started a blog. You had a YouTube channel, I guess, pretty early on.
Yeah,
you probably had a Facebook page.
Yes, yeah.
You started to create the branding around your quote unquote practice, but you didn't like LLC and get an EIN and all that stuff right away.
And that was part of like, with going into private practice, it was something I thought about, but never really considered, I'm going to do this full time, for the rest of my life, because it just wasn't something that was like talked about a ton in my undergrad or my internship. It was like, go out and get a clinical job or, go out and get a job in the community, as other options, but they didn't have like a private practice rotation or an entrepreneurship rotation.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that there's not an entrepreneurial route in pretty much any field, it seems. The only time I've ever heard of small business / entrepreneurship as a track for a degree specialization is in a business school. It was an option for me when I was studying business in college. It was one of the options.
Yeah, and I hope that changes, to be honest, because
it should be an option for so many things.
Yeah, there's quite a couple of internships recently that I've come across just because I've had the interns reach out to me, have an entrepreneurial like 2-week rotation, but other ones it's under their elective. So unless the intern is specifically looking to go into private practice, they might not choose that as their elective. And so, it's not like where clinical, food service, long-term care, those are part of the internship. They're part of that accreditation. So like you have to do those rotations, whereas like private practice, you don't need to. But
it's kind of unfortunate that private practice is not front and center during the educational period of your career as a dietitian. It's just not put to you as a realistic opportunity or an option. That said, that may be changing now when you were in college. Not that you're like an old person or whatever, but the technology for a lot of what you do didn't exist.
No, yeah. A lot's changed, definitely.
You were in college. What year did you start college?
2009.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, it's 2021. We're going back 12 years there.
Yeah. Well.
So a lot of things are different. The environment online is different. You didn't really have Zoom or like a lot of things where you use the tools that you use now. Some of them didn't exist back then.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll change in the future.
No, and I definitely think, and I think it's slowly starting to change. And so that hopefully will be.
Well, okay, but back to your experience. Yeah. So you kind of eased into it. You got out of college. You were working at the community center as a dietitian there.
Yeah.
And you were creating little things here and there for yourself. You sort of created some of the stuff that you have still, where it's a free platform. It didn't cost you anything. And you just you got the name Peraza Nutrition because that's your last name, plus the word nutrition. I think your first blog was Nutrition at Your Fingertips.
Yes, yeah.
It's
just generic.
Just something, but you started early.
Yeah.
Doing your own thing while also working a traditional job as a dietitian for a company.
Yes. Yeah. So when I finished my internship in 2014, and then I was already working at the YMCA. I used to do, I was a
You did like
preschool.
swim instruction and
Yeah,
like
preschool
classes with
movement
kids.
instructor was my title, and so I did.
Preschool movement instructor.
Yeah, so I had
Children, this is how you move.
Yes, it was like gymnastics classes for kids, and I did air quotes there. Gymnastics classes for kids like 6 and under. So, we're looking like toddler tumbling and stuff like that. But
So you already had a job there. You already had an in there, basically, and
yes.
you moved up within the community center as a dietitian once you got out of college.
Yeah, so when I was in college, we started doing like some general nutrition education seminars. So just on so nothing was medical nutrition therapy, nothing out of scope. It was just general education. And then
Basic stuff.
Yes.
What is fiber?
Exactly.
What's a blueberry?
So basically things you could find on like the CDC website or things like that. So that was kind of where we started actually kind of infusing nutrition a little bit. And then once I became a dietitian, then I started doing more specific. Then I was doing counseling and still doing some of the fitness stuff too, like with the kids, but because I liked doing that. And then also kind of adding more of the nutrition. And I was kind of building the program there too, because they didn't have a dietitian already. So it was more of like, let's see what works in a sense too. So that was actually really cool to be a part of trying to figure out what to do and, how to go about it.
You were you were really involved in the construction of the program itself.
Yeah, I started working with like their school age program and doing like fun nutrition type tips with the kids and like all of these different activities. I worked with their summer program where I taught the kids about nutrition. And so it was, again, kind of building along the way. So that I was doing part-time. And then I got a job part-time originally working as a retail dietitian. And so that was in 2014 that I got the part-time job. So I was doing 2 part-time jobs. And then along that way, I started kind of building the practice a little bit. Not really.
And to reiterate, when you say building the practice, you're literally making a Facebook page, writing blog posts. It's
Yes.
not that serious.
Yeah. And then I started creating forms because it was also forms that I was starting to create, in the retail job and then also in the community center at the Y. And so I was building these forms and these handouts, kind of building like a collection of things, but also seeing like what would I need to do if I was like doing this for myself. So kind of building it for the role. And then also like I'm going to utilize these things later too.
So your first part-time job as a dietitian was at a place where you already worked and they created the program around you because you had something to offer.
Yes.
Something important to keep in mind. If you have a job somewhere and there's any way to shoehorn in dietetics or that there's a way to present value to them in a way that they're not already offering it, that is an option.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be big first. Like I started with like tips in the fitness center. So it was like a tip a week about like just like oranges and vitamin C, like very general basic things. But it was just a way to kind of get people interested in nutrition. And then I used to send a newsletter out to the childcare parents. So it went home with and it was like usually a kid-friendly recipe and then like a nutrition tip. And then it was a way to like get people interested in nutrition. So then we started thinking about like we ran a seminar here and then we ran a seminar here and then we did a program. And so it was like a slow build, but part of it was just starting with something.
You used a job you already had and you took advantage of a network you had already created for yourself with the jobs that you had during high school and college to get some of that dietetics stuff off the ground for yourself.
Yes.
Always important to consider what you already have available. And if it's not explicitly there for you, sometimes it can be created or it's there and you just can't see it yet.
Yeah.
So it's important to keep that in mind. I think other people probably have that opportunity and maybe it's not as obvious.
Yeah, definitely.
But then you also worked at the grocery store.
Yes.
Part-time.
Yeah. So I was working there part-time and it was about a year of doing, or not even a year actually, a couple months of being part-time that I got hired full-time. And then that's when I ended up leaving the Y job just because I had started my master's and then it was too much.
Yeah, well, you were pursuing your master's while you were working full time.
Yeah. So
it was kind of a lot.
It was kind of a lot. And then that's when I started, we mentioned like some of the little things I was doing to build my business. And then it was about 2015 when I started the process of becoming an insurance provider, and that took a couple of months. But that was when I really started to kind of build the business itself outside of like having a website and, creating some forms, but also, okay, what do I need to make sure everything is legal and that I'm registered as a business besides having a website?
So you chipped away at it over the course of a few years.
Yeah.
While you were working part-time, while you were working full-time, while you were pursuing your master's.
Yes.
It wasn't something that happened overnight.
Mm-mm.
You didn't just flip a switch and all of a sudden, boom,
Yeah.
now you're a private practice dietitian.
Mm-hmm.
It was something that you slowly built to over the course of 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah. So I left the full-time job in 2016. So it was
So you
about
finished your
2 years?
internship in 2014?
2014.
And you slowly started creating things, and then you were full-time in 2016.
2014, I was full-time. Or sorry, yeah.
2016, you were full-time working, and that's when you left, or was it 2017?
Yes, I left, it was December of 2016 when I left my full-time job as a retail dietitian.
To
I
go full-time with your practice.
Yes, yeah, I should have clarified that with those. Yeah, it was 20, and I left in December, which was just like an odd
The end of the year,
Yeah.
it was practically 2017. The
Yeah.
point is that it was almost 3 years
Yes.
between when you finished your internship program and passed your exam,
Mhm.
between passing the exam and being a full-time private practice dietitian.
Yes, yeah, and it was like a year that I really dedicated the time to building, the actual all of the intricacies of the practice itself, and it's still obviously changed a lot over the years, so it's, I didn't have everything figured out, when I quit my full-time job, but my main things was that making sure that I was able to I was a provider, and I had a client base, and I was able to get, like, actually reimbursed for the services.
So before you went full-time, you were already an insurance provider.
Yes, yeah.
And, obviously the money wasn't amazing. You weren't
Yeah.
swimming in dough the first few months that you went into private practice full-time.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a risk
Mhm.
there you're incurring, but just like any small business, that's the name of the game.
Yeah.
You have to have risk tolerance and good risk assessment
Yes.
to get into this and make it.
Mhm.
Really. It's not a cushy gig.
No.
You don't have a paycheck coming your way guaranteed every 2 weeks or whatever.
Mm-mm.
You're on your own.
Yeah.
That
And
said, you didn't just jump into it making $0 a month.
exactly. It was calculated where, I had hit the point where I couldn't take on any more clients in my private practice. And I was kind of like maxed out in terms of like I was running from this job to this. And it was just, and I did have, we talked about the cooking classes I did on the previous podcast. And I had some consistent gigs lined up contract wise and then the client base. So that's, my comfort level, but also having a little bit of a steady income in a sense with the practice while still, obviously risk involved.
So the point and kind of the takeaway, I guess, is that you don't have to make the leap of blind faith into private practice. You don't just up and quit your full-time job and then start a private practice. You in particular, slowly eased into a full-time private practice because you had your full-time job. And when you weren't working at the full-time job, you were building your practice.
Yeah.
And you got to a point where you maxed out what you could do in the private practice. And it seemed like it would be financially viable if you left your full-time job and devoted everything to the private practice. It's not like it was easy to walk away from your salaried dietetics job.
Yeah. Having
But
benefits and yeah.
It was a decision that you made,
exactly.
and it was a commitment
Yeah.
to dedicate yourself to the practice and go full time.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
it's not easy,
No.
and there's no guarantee of success. That said, the benefits are pretty vast.
Yes.
You're your own boss. You set your own hours.
Mhm.
You do your own thing.
Yeah.
You don't have to answer to anyone.
Mm-mm.
It's all you,
Yes.
and that's the dream.
Yeah.
That's why you'd want to be in a private practice in the first place. Just don't think you have to do it all at once.
No. And it doesn't mean that you have to, we kind of talked about this a little bit is, you don't have to just be in private practice too. I mean, my goal was to, leave my full-time job and be in private practice, but it might be that part-time job and having a private practice is where you want to be. So it doesn't have to be like all or nothing. Like success is having a full-time private practice that might like look a lot differently to different people.
Well, case in point, what are you doing right now?
So right now I'm teaching, and I kind of fell. I always say I fell into teaching, and part of that was someone posted about a teaching opportunity.
To clarify, now, currently, you have a private practice.
Yes.
But you are also a full-time college instructor.
Yes.
You teach nutrition at the college level.
Yes.
Full-time.
Full-time.
You are a full-time college faculty member.
Yes.
As well as a private practice dietitian.
Yes.
You went from working a full-time retail job
Mm-hmm.
and doing your private practice part-time
Yep.
to doing just your private practice full-time for a couple years, right?
For about 2.5, almost 3 years, because I got into teaching part-time as an adjunct faculty member, or adjunct
You're getting ahead
teacher.
of me here.
Sorry.
So you did just your private practice full-time for a couple years.
Yes,
and
I
that's
did.
all you did.
That's all I did.
And it was a full-time living.
Mhm.
You were financially successful.
Yeah.
It was good.
Yep.
And then you saw an opportunity to teach at college.
Yes.
And you took it, and you were part-time at first,
Mm-hmm.
and you enjoyed it.
I did. I still do.
And now she's gone from teaching part-time to you're not only a full-time instructor at the college, you're very involved in the college. It's something you really enjoy doing.
Yes, I like that space.
She loves it. And here is part of the conception with private practice and working a job is that, there may be a misconception saying that like you're only successful as a business person, as a small business owner, if that's how you make, your living and you don't have to have a full-time job. There's this kind of thing where it's like the freedom of being your own boss and this and that. But if you have a job that you love,
Mm-hmm.
if you have a job that you love, the saying is you'll never work a day in your life. You're a full-time teacher.
Yeah.
And you love it.
I do. And that's, I just, someone like 2 weeks ago said this to me too. It was like, oh, well, eventually you're not really knowing me. Oh, eventually your practice will grow and then you can leave your teaching job. And I was like, well, that's a bold assumption.
Well, and the funny thing is you already did the full-time private practice thing. You liked it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something you still do.
Yeah.
But now you balance it with a full-time college instructor job.
Yes.
That you also love.
Exactly.
The end-all, be-all isn't just being your own boss and having a private practice and running your business.
Mm-hmm.
It can be whatever you want it to be.
Yeah.
For you, your journey is here now.
It is.
You're teaching full-time.
Mm-hmm.
You have a client load for your private business, your private practice, your small business.
Mm-hmm.
And we're here talking to you right now about how you can get into private practice too. Felicia's direction at this point is moving toward helping other dietitians find what their passion is and get into a practice if that's what they like to do. There's a lot of mystique and mystery around having a private practice. That's kind of the point of this podcast.
Yes.
But the major point here is that success is whatever makes you happy.
Yes.
And for a lot of people, it is a private practice, and it doesn't have to be the only thing you do full time.
No, yeah, and even like with teaching, and I love teaching, and I like being in that academic space. But I also, it's a job that's flexible too, where I can choose to teach over the summer. I can choose to teach over the winter session. Otherwise, that can also be 4 solid months that it's just my practice again. So I have flexibility too. And I'm not working like a 40-hour work week. And so, that's the kind of job that I also enjoy, but I also obviously enjoy the teaching aspect of it too. So, it's finding what you enjoy, but also something that's going to work with your lifestyle and what your goals are. So
all that said, you don't have to go into clinical right out of your internship. There's a lot of other things you can do. There's a lot of other jobs that will serve you well when you are looking to start your private practice and get into it. We've covered a lot of bases here. You don't have to be full-time in a private practice. It can be your part-time gig forever. It can be your side hustle.
Yeah.
It can be whatever you want it to be. But you don't necessarily have to start as a clinical dietitian to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of other roles that serve being a private practice dietitian far better. Being a clinical dietitian it's a great job. Nothing wrong with it.
No.
But it will not serve you very well as a private practice dietitian. There's not a lot of transferable skill coming out of a clinical role. And there are other roles that would serve you better as a private practice dietitian, such as retail dietetics, community dietetics, maybe working in a government program like WIC or the military, perhaps.
Yeah.
or a school as a food service manager / dietitian, something like that kind of hybrid role. All of those jobs will give you a leg up starting a private practice because you'll get into networking, marketing, finance. There's a lot of other stuff outside of dietetics that you'll have to learn and get good with in order to be successful as a private practice dietitian. Those other roles will serve you far better than a clinical dietitian's job would in this specific context of
Yes.
of having the long-term goal of being a private practice dietitian. That said, take whatever job you want to take. Merely the suggestion of Felicia, who has been down this road and can see things from a perspective that is maybe not as obvious to someone looking to get into private practice, but doesn't know all this stuff.
Yeah. And it's not to say, we kind of highlighted that, there's not a lot of transferable kinds of things that could happen with clinical to private practice. But if that's the job that you end up getting and you just need something, especially becoming a dietitian, glean from that. Like try to see what information or things that you could pull from that to, grow not only as a dietitian, but as a professional and in a private practice. So there's always things you can glean from whatever job, even if it's like, this is not what I want to do long term, that can serve you well in a different space of dietetics. So.
Yeah, the whole point is that you don't need to go the clinical route.
Yeah.
You can go any route you want. In fact, there's a case to be made that other routes will serve you better for private practice. All that said, it's not like you can't start with clinical and get into private practice. You totally, absolutely can. Totally can. It's totally fine. I think we capped it off pretty good there.
Yeah.
Any final closing thoughts for this topic?
I mean, I think we ended on a lot of good things. The only other thing I would just mention is if you are working in whatever space you are in and you're deciding to start building your private practice, depending on the job that you're currently employed at, just make sure that there's no non-compete clauses where it prevents you from starting like a private practice on this side. So they did not have that when I was a retail dietitian, but I've heard of that from other dietitians in different spaces that they do not allow you to, start a practice or start taking, like not to take any clients after and all of that thing. So just make sure that you're, not in violation of anything with your current job before starting. So
stay out of trouble.
Yeah.
Don't want to get sued.
No.
All right. What's on the horizon for My RD Journey? What are we thinking about next? If you're listening, thanks for hanging out with us for so long. We're looking to start doing more short form content soon.
Yes.
So videos that are smaller, edited on more specific topics that we don't cover so broadly. Of course, we'll keep doing the podcast because it's fun and we like doing this.
Yes.
But we're looking to do some short form content coming up in the near future. What's our next podcast topic? Do we know yet?
I don't know actually for the podcast. I just planned out the mini. I keep saying mini, but small video content. So I'm excited for those ones.
All right. Yeah. More to come for sure. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't. And if you wouldn't mind, rate us on iTunes or Spotify or however you're listening to this.
Yeah.
Because that really helps out a ton. But that is going to do it for us here at the My RD Journey podcast. Thanks so much for being with us.